The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured parade grounds of Fort Mitchell as Staff Sergeant Audrey Lopez stood at attention, her uniform crisp and immaculate despite the Georgia humidity. At 28, she commanded respect from recruits twice her size with nothing more than a glance. But what those wide-eyed teenagers didn't know was that just 5 years earlier, their drill instructor had been told she'd never make it past week 1 of basic training. "You're too small, too weak, and frankly, too emotional for military life," the recruitment officer had said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Maybe consider the Peace Corps instead." Today, Staff Sergeant Lopez was about to prove just how wrong they'd all been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Audrey Lopez had always been small for her age. At 5'2" and barely 110 pounds, she'd spent most of her childhood being overlooked, underestimated, and told what she couldn't do. Growing up in East Los Angeles, the youngest of 4 children in a single-parent household, Audrey had learned early that life didn't hand out participation trophies. Her mother, Maria Lopez, worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, cleaning offices downtown during the day and stocking shelves at a grocery store at night. Her 3 older brothers had all found their own paths. Miguel joined a local gang and was serving time by age 19. Carlos dropped out of high school to work construction, and Daniel had managed to get a scholarship to community college before disappearing one day without explanation. "Mija," her mother would say during their rare quiet moments together, "you're different from your brothers. You have something special up here," she'd tap her temple. "But this world, it's not going to make it easy for a girl like you." Audrey knew what she meant. In her neighborhood, girls had limited options: get pregnant young, work minimum wage jobs forever, or maybe, if they were lucky, marry someone who could provide a better life. None of those futures appealed to her. School had been her refuge. While her classmates at Roosevelt High School seemed content to drift through their courses, Audrey threw herself into her studies with an intensity that both impressed and worried her teachers. She maintained a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a local diner to help with family expenses. It was during her senior year that she first seriously considered the military. The recruiter, Sergeant First Class Patricia Williams, had set up a booth in the school cafeteria during lunch period. Most students walked past without a second glance, but something about the confident way Sergeant Williams carried herself caught Audrey's attention. "You interested in serving your country, young lady?" Williams had asked when Audrey approached the table. "I'm interested in serving myself first," Audrey replied honestly. "I need a way out, and I need training for a real career." Williams smiled. "Honest answer, I respect that. What's your name?" "Audrey Lopez." "Well, Audrey Lopez, the Army can definitely provide both of those things. Question is, are you tough enough to earn them?" That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. Audrey researched everything she could about military life, career opportunities, and the benefits of service. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this was her path forward. The problem was, nobody else agreed. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, had been the first to express doubt. "Audrey, you're a bright girl with a lot of potential. Have you considered applying to state universities? With your grades, you could get financial aid." "I've looked into it," Audrey replied. "I can't afford to take on that kind of debt, and I can't expect my mother to support me for 4 more years. But the military, that's such a drastic step. It's dangerous, especially for young women. And frankly, you don't exactly have the physical presence that military life demands." Those words stung, but Audrey kept her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago not to let people see when they'd gotten under her skin. Her family's reaction was even worse. Her mother cried when Audrey first mentioned the idea. "Mia, no. That life is too hard. Too dangerous. Look what happened to the Rodriguez boy. Came back from Afghanistan with only one leg. Find another way. Carlos, her brother, was more direct. Are you insane? You can't even open a pickle jar without help. What makes you think you can handle combat training? But it was Miguel's reaction that hurt the most. During one of her rare visits to see him in county lockup, she'd mentioned her plans. Little sister, he said, shaking his head sadly, you always were a dreamer, but this fantasy of yours, it's going to end with you coming home broken, or worse. These people don't care about girls from the barrio. They'll chew you up and spit you out. Despite the chorus of doubts, Audrey pressed forward. She began a self-imposed training regimen, waking up at 5 a.m. to run through her neighborhood before school. She did push-ups and sit-ups in her bedroom every night. She researched proper nutrition and tried to build muscle mass on a tight budget. Physical improvements were slow but steady. More importantly, the discipline required to maintain her routine was building something inside her, a confidence that had nothing to do with what other people thought she could or couldn't do. When she finally walked into the recruitment office 6 months later, she felt ready. That confidence lasted exactly 30 seconds. Staff Sergeant James Morrison looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. At 6'4", with arms like tree trunks, he seemed to fill the entire office with his presence. So you want to be a soldier, he said, not bothering to disguise his doubts. Yes, Sergeant. You understand this isn't summer camp, right? This is serious business. People's lives depend on soldiers doing their jobs correctly under extreme pressure. I understand that, Sergeant. Morrison pulled out a clipboard and began asking routine questions: height, weight, education, family history. With each answer, his frown deepened. 5'12", 112 pounds, he muttered, making notes. Have you ever played sports? No, Sergeant. I worked after school. Any martial arts training? Self-defense classes? No, Sergeant. Morrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Miss Lopez, I'm going to be straight with you. The Army isn't a social experiment. We need soldiers who can carry their own weight, literally. A soldier who can't keep up with their unit, who needs special accommodations, who becomes a liability in the field. That soldier gets people killed. Audrey felt her cheeks burning, but she kept her voice steady. I'm willing to work harder than anyone else, Sergeant. I'll do whatever it takes. Work ethic is admirable, Morrison replied, but it can't overcome basic physical limitations. You're talking about carrying a 70-pound pack over rough terrain for miles at a time. You're talking about combat situations where upper body strength could mean the difference between life and death. I'm not saying these things to be mean. I'm saying them because I care about the safety of our soldiers. So you won't let me enlist? Morrison sighed. I didn't say that. If you can pass the initial fitness tests and the doctor clears you medically, I have to process your application. But Miss Lopez... I strongly recommend you consider other options. The Peace Corps does excellent work. Or maybe look into civilian roles that support the military. There are plenty of ways to serve without putting yourself through something you're not built for. The medical examination was routine: height, weight, vision, hearing, basic mobility tests. Dr. Rachel Foster, the examining physician, was more encouraging than Morrison had been. You're in decent shape for your size, she noted, though. You'll definitely need to build more muscle mass before basic training. Your cardiovascular health is good, no obvious physical limitations. I'm going to clear you medically, but I want you to understand what you're signing up for. Everyone keeps telling me what I can't do, Audrey said. Isn't there anyone who believes I can succeed? Dr. Foster paused in her note-taking and looked at Audrey directly. Honey, I've been doing these examinations for 15 years. I've seen big, strong recruits wash out in week 2, and I've seen people half their size graduate at the top of their class. Physical ability matters, but it's not everything. Mental toughness, determination, the ability to adapt and overcome. Those things matter more. She continued writing, then added, "But I'm going to be honest with you. The next few months are going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. If you have any doubts, any at all, now is the time to reconsider." "I don't have doubts about wanting this," Audrey replied. "I have doubts about whether I'm strong enough. But I'd rather find out by trying than spend my whole life wondering." Dr. Foster smiled for the first time during the examination. "That's the right attitude. Just remember, basic training isn't designed to break you down permanently. It's designed to build you back up stronger. Trust the process, even when it feels impossible." The paperwork was completed, the oath was taken, and suddenly Audrey had a ship-out date, November 15th, Fort Benning, Georgia. She had 6 weeks to prepare. Those 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Audrey intensified her training. Routine, spending every free moment building her physical conditioning. She studied military customs and courtesies, memorized the rank structure, and read everything she could find about what to expect at basic training. Her mother alternated between pride and worry. "I still think you're crazy," Maria said during Audrey's last dinner at home. "But you've always been stubborn. Just promise me you'll be careful, and remember that you have nothing to prove to anyone but yourself." The night before leaving for Fort Benning, Audrey lay awake staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom. In a few hours she'd be on a bus heading toward the unknown. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, came down to whether she could survive the next 10 weeks of basic training. She thought about Sergeant Morrison's warnings, about all the people who'd told her she wasn't cut out for military life. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was deluding herself about her capabilities. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in her mind. The only way to find out was to try. And whatever happened, she was going to give everything she had. Tomorrow, her real test would begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bus ride to Fort Benning was silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional nervous cough from one of the 42 recruits packed into the military transport. Audrey sat near the middle, sandwiched between a massive farm boy from Nebraska named Tyler Richardson and a wiry kid from Detroit called Marcus Williams, who couldn't seem to stop bouncing his leg. As they passed through the gates of Fort Benning at 0300 hours, Audrey caught her first glimpse of what would be home for the next 10 weeks. Even in the darkness, the place looked imposing. Rows of identical barracks, perfectly maintained grounds, and an atmosphere of controlled efficiency that made her stomach clench with anticipation. The bus screeched to a halt in front of a well-lit building. Before anyone could fully process where they were, the doors flew open and chaos erupted. "Get off my bus! Move! Move!" The voice belonged to Drill Sergeant Michael Torres, though Audrey wouldn't learn his name for several more hours. What she did know immediately was that this man could probably bench press a small car and seemed genuinely angry about their very existence. Recruits stumbled over each other in their haste to exit the bus, duffel bags colliding, feet tangling. Audrey barely managed to grab her gear before being swept along in the tide of bodies rushing toward the yellow footprints painted on the concrete. "Find a footprint and shut your mouth," Torres roared. "You are no longer civilians. You are no longer special. You are the sorest excuse for potential soldiers I have ever had the misfortune to encounter." Audrey found herself on a set of footprints between Tyler, who was sweating profusely despite the cool November air, and a tall girl from Phoenix named Sarah Chun, who looked like she'd stepped out of a fitness magazine. "When I call your name, you will respond with, 'Yes, Drill Sergeant.' Is that understood?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant," the group shouted, though their timing was ragged and uncoordinated. Torres began reading names from his clipboard, each response followed by a barked command to move to a specific location. When he reached Lopez Audrey, she responded as instructed and was directed to join a group of female recruits standing at attention near the building entrance. As the initial formation process continued, Audrey became aware of other drill sergeants moving through the crowd like sharks sensing blood in the water. They seemed to have an uncanny ability to spot weakness, fear, or any deviation from perfect military bearing. Drill Sergeant Lisa Morgan approached the female recruits, where Torres was built like a linebacker. Morgan was lean and angular, with eyes that seemed to catalog every imperfection in the ranks before her. "Ladies," she began, her voice carrying despite being considerably quieter than Torres, "you have exactly 4 minutes to get yourselves and your gear into that barracks. You will find your assigned bunk, stow your civilian belongings, and return to this position. If any one of you is late, all of you will pay the price. Move." The next few minutes were a blur of confusion and panic. Audrey found her assigned bunk, bottom rack, third bay from the entrance, and quickly stuffed her duffel bag into the metal locker. Around her, other recruits struggled with the same process, some clearly fighting back tears. Her bunkmate, sleeping in the rack above her, was a girl named Jennifer Kowalski from Cleveland. Jennifer was maybe 5'6", with the build of someone who'd played high school athletics, and she looked nearly as overwhelmed as Audrey felt. "This is insane," Jennifer whispered as they made their way back outside. "Do they always scream like that?" "I think this is just the beginning," Audrey replied, remembering everything she'd read about the shock treatment of military indoctrination. They were right. The next 18 hours were a continuous cycle of administrative processing, medical checks, uniform issue, and constant harassment from the drill sergeants. Every movement was scrutinized, every response evaluated, every sign of weakness exploited. During the uniform fitting, Audrey ran into her first major obstacle. Even the smallest sizes were too large for her frame. The duty uniform hung on her like a tent, and the physical training gear wasn't much better. Well, what do we have here?" Drill Sergeant Morgan had appeared behind her during the fitting process. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little toy soldier." Several other recruits turned to look, and Audrey felt heat rise in her cheeks. "The uniform will be altered to fit properly, Drill Sergeant." "Will it now?" Morgan walked slowly around her, inspecting the baggy fatigues. "Tell me, Lopez, what made you think you belonged in my army?" "I want to serve my country, Drill Sergeant." "Huh. Noble. And exactly how do you plan to serve when you look like a child playing dress-up in daddy's clothes?" The other recruits were watching now, some with sympathy, others with the kind of relief that came from not being the target. Audrey kept her eyes straight ahead, fighting the urge to defend herself. "I'll prove myself through my actions, Drill Sergeant." Morgan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level only Audrey could hear. "Actions require capability, recruit. And capability requires a basic level of physical presence. I've seen dozens of recruits like you wash out in the first week because they couldn't handle the reality of what we do here." She stepped back and addressed the group. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. The Army doesn't care about your feelings, your excuses, or your limitations. It cares about results. If you can't meet the standard, you don't belong here." The first physical training session came at 05:30 the next morning. Audrey had managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, her mind racing with anxiety about what was to come. The wake-up call was Drill Sergeant Torres pounding on a metal trash can and shouting at volumes that seemed to violate several laws of physics. "Rise and shine, maggots. Welcome to your new reality. You have exactly 4 minutes to be in PT formation outside this building. If you're not there, you're quitting." The scramble that followed made the previous day's bus exit look organized. Recruits collided with each other, searched frantically for required items, and generally demonstrated that 42 people can create the chaos level typically associated with several hundred. Audrey managed to get dressed and outside within the time limit, but just barely. She found herself in the front row of the formation, directly in Torres's line of sight. "Today we find out who really wants to be here," Torres announced, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "We're going to do a little diagnostic PT test. Nothing fancy, just push-ups, sit-ups, and a 1-mile run. Consider it your baseline." What followed was the most physically demanding hour of Audrey's life. The push-up test revealed the stark gap between her preparation and the Army standard. While some recruits easily exceeded the minimum requirements, Audrey struggled to complete 15 proper push-ups before her arms gave out. "Time," Torres called. "Lopez, how many?" 15, Drill Sergeant. 15. Torres shook his head sadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have our first project. 15 push-ups wouldn't qualify you for the Girl Scouts, much less the United States Army." The sit-ups went better. Audrey managed 38 in 2 minutes, which was closer to acceptable. But it was the run that really exposed her. Limitations. The 1-mile course took the group through several hills and around a small lake. Within the first quarter mile, the formation had spread out considerably. Audrey found herself in the back. Third, her short legs working overtime to maintain pace with longer strided recruits. By the halfway point, she was struggling. Her lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, and several recruits had already lapped her. Tyler Richardson, the farm boy from Nebraska, jogged past her going the opposite direction, not even breathing hard. "Pick it up, Lopez." Drill Sergeant Morgan had appeared beside her, keeping pace effortlessly despite not appearing to exert any effort. "At this rate, you'll finish sometime next Tuesday." Audrey tried to increase her pace but felt her form deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing became ragged and she could taste copper in her mouth. "I can't keep up, she gasped. "Can't." Morgan's voice turned dangerous. "Did you just tell me you can't do something?" "I'm trying, Drill Sergeant." "Trying isn't good enough. Results are what matter. Either you finish this run or you quit and go home." The final quarter mile was pure agony. Audrey's vision started to tunnel, and her legs felt completely disconnected from her body. Several recruits had already finished and were standing in formation, watching the stragglers complete the course. When she finally crossed the finish line, Audrey collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping for air. Her time, 14 minutes and 37 seconds, was nearly 4 minutes slower than the code 7 seconds minimum requirement. Torres stood over her as she tried to recover. "Congratulations, Lopez. You've just set the record for the slowest run time in Company Delta history." As she struggled to her feet, Audrey became aware of the other recruits watching her with a mixture of pity and concern. Some looked relieved that they weren't in her position. Others seemed genuinely sympathetic, but powerless to help. Jennifer Kowalski approached her during the brief water break that followed. "Hey, you okay?" "I'll be fine," Audrey replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Look, that was rough, but it's only day 1. You'll get stronger." "If I last long enough to get stronger." Jennifer glanced around to make sure the drill sergeants weren't listening. "My older brother went through this place 2 years ago. He said the first week is designed to break people down, to get the quitters to quit early. The ones who really want it find a way to survive. And the ones who really want it, but aren't physically capable? I guess we'll find out." That evening, during the brief period allotted for personal time, Audrey sat on her bunk and assessed her situation honestly. The physical training had been a disaster. Her uniform didn't fit. The drill sergeants had clearly identified her as the weak link in the chain. And it was only the second day that she thought about Sergeant Morrison's warnings, about her family's concerns, about Dr. Foster's advice. To trust the process, even when it felt impossible. Right now it felt very close to impossible. Around her, other recruits were dealing with their own challenges. Marcus Williams was writing a letter home, tears streaming down his face. Sarah Chun was doing push-ups next to her bunk, trying to maintain her obvious physical advantages. Jennifer was reading from what appeared to be a religious text. Lopez. Drill Sergeant Morgan appeared at the foot of her bunk. A word. Audrey followed her outside the barracks to a small area where they could speak privately. "Recruit, I'm going." "To be straight with you," Morgan began, "your performance today was unacceptable by every measure we use. You're physically unprepared, you're mentally shaken, and you're becoming a liability to your unit." Audrey started to respond, but Morgan held up a hand. "I'm not finished. Now you have a choice to make. You can continue struggling through this process, falling further behind every day, becoming more of a burden to your fellow soldiers. Or you can do the smart thing and request a discharge. No shame in recognizing when something isn't the right fit." The offer hung in the air between them. Morgan wasn't being cruel. She was offering Audrey an honorable way out, a chance to leave before the situation became even more humiliating. "Drill Sergeant," Audrey said finally. "Permission to speak freely? Granted. I didn't come here because I thought it would be easy. I came here because I need to find out what I'm capable of. Maybe I'll fail. Maybe I'll wash out tomorrow. But I'd rather fail trying than succeed at quitting." Morgan studied her for a long moment. "That's a nice speech, recruit. But speeches don't do push-ups. Speeches don't run miles. And speeches don't carry wounded soldiers to safety." "No, Drill Sergeant, they don't. But they keep people going when everything else tells them to quit." For just a moment, something flickered in Morgan's expression. Not approval exactly, but perhaps a grudging recognition of something she hadn't expected to see. "All right, Lopez, we'll see what you're made of. But understand this, I'm not going to give you special treatment, and I'm not going to lower the standards. You either meet them or you don't. I understand, Drill Sergeant. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start weapons training, and you're already behind in every other area. You can't afford to fall behind in this one too." As Audrey returned to her bunk, she knew that Drill Sergeant Morgan was right about one thing. She was already behind, and the gap was likely to get worse before it got better. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, she felt something other than fear and doubt. She felt determination. Week 3 at Fort Benning brought the kind of relentless pressure that separated those who truly wanted to be soldiers from those who simply thought they did. For Audrey Lopez, each day had become a battle against her own limitations, fought under the constant scrutiny of drill sergeants who seemed determined to find her breaking point. The weapons training had been a mixed blessing. While Audrey struggled with the physical demands of carrying and maneuvering the M16A2 rifle, at nearly 8 pounds, it represented a significant percentage of her total body weight. She discovered an unexpected aptitude for marksmanship. Her small hands fit naturally around the grip, and her steady nerves translated into consistent accuracy on the firing range. "Well, I'll be damned," Drill Sergeant Torres had muttered during her first qualifying session, watching as Audrey consistently hit targets that some of the bigger recruits were missing entirely. "Looks like our little toy soldier can actually shoot." But marksmanship alone couldn't compensate for her struggles in every other area. The obstacle course remained a daily humiliation, where other recruits bounded over walls and crawled under barriers with increasing confidence. Audrey continued to lag behind, her arms shaking from the effort of pulling her body weight up and over obstacles designed for much larger soldiers. Rope climb was particularly brutal. At 15 feet tall, the thick manila rope might as well have been Mount Everest. While recruits like Tyler Richardson scaled it in seconds, Audrey couldn't make it past the halfway point despite multiple attempts that left her hands raw and bleeding. "Lopez." Drill Sergeant Morgan's voice cut across the training area as Audrey hung suspended 8 feet off the ground, her grip failing. "What's the problem now? I can single quotes T. my hands." Audrey gasped, her arms burning with lactic acid. "Can't again." "That's your favorite word, isn't it?" Recruit? Audrey dropped to the ground. Hard, her knees buckling on impact. Around her, other recruits continued their training, but she could feel their glances, the mixture of sympathy and growing frustration that came from being repeatedly held back by the weakest member of their unit. It was Jennifer Kowalski who helped her to her feet. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's get your hands cleaned up." In the latrine, Jennifer examined Audrey's palms, which were torn and bleeding from repeated attempts at the rope climb. "This is getting serious," she said, dabbing at the wounds with a wet paper towel. "You need to see the medic." "I can't," Audrey replied. "If I go to medical, they'll think I'm looking for an excuse to get out of training. And if you don't, you're going to get infected hands and really be in trouble." Before Audrey could respond, the door burst open and 3 other recruits entered: Sarah Chun, Marcus Williams, and a girl named Rebecca. Martinez from Texas had been growing increasingly vocal about her frustrations with the training pace. "Oh, great," Rebecca said, seeing Audrey's bandaged hands. "Let me guess, another injury that's going to slow down the whole company." "Back off, Martinez," Jennifer warned. "No, I'm tired of backing off. We're all suffering because one person can't keep up. Do you know we've had to repeat obstacle course training 3 times this week because Lopez can't complete it in the time limit?" Sarah Chun stepped between them. "That's enough. We're supposed to be a team." "Teams don't carry dead weight," Rebecca shot back. "And that's exactly what she is. Dead weight that's going to get us all recycled or worse." The words hit Audrey like physical blows. Being recycled meant being held back, sent to start training over with a new company, extending the already grueling process by weeks or months. But worse than that was the growing realization that Rebecca might be right. Her struggles were affecting everyone else. "Maybe I should just quit," Audrey said quietly. "Don't you dare," Jennifer said firmly. "Don't let her get in your head." "It's not just her," Audrey replied. "Look at the facts. I'm dead last in PT scores. I can't complete half the obstacle course. I'm holding everyone back. Maybe the smart thing is to cut losses and go home." That night, as the company settled into their bunks for another few hours of precious sleep, Audrey lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The physical pain was manageable. Her hands would heal, her muscles would adapt. But the psychological weight of constant failure was becoming unbearable. She thought about calling her mother, about hearing Maria Lopez tell her that it was okay to come home, that she'd tried her best, and that was enough. The fantasy was almost irresistible. Around 0200 hours, she was startled by a gentle touch on her shoulder. Jennifer was standing beside her bunk, fully dressed. "Can't sleep either?" Jennifer whispered. Audrey shook her head. "Come on, let's take a walk." They slipped quietly out of the barracks into the cool Georgia night. The base was never truly quiet. There was always the distant sound of training exercises, vehicles moving, the low hum of activity that never stopped at a major military installation. "My brother told me something when I was struggling in high school," Jennifer said as they walked slowly between the buildings. "He said that everyone has a moment where they have to decide who they really are. Not who they think they are, not who other people say they are, but who they choose to be when everything is against them. And what if you choose to be someone you're not capable of being? Then you fail. But at least you fail as yourself, not as the person other people expected you to be." They sat down on a bench near the base chapel, a small building that seemed to offer a pocket of peace in the otherwise intense environment. "Can I tell you something?" Jennifer continued. "I almost quit yesterday." Audrey looked at her in surprise. Jennifer was one of the stronger performers in their company, someone who seemed to handle the training with relative ease. "I got a letter from my boyfriend back home. He's been seeing someone else while I've been here. Said he couldn't wait for me to finish training, that military life wasn't compatible with the kind of relationship he wanted. I'm sorry." The thing is, for about an hour, I was ready to give up everything just to go home and try to fix things with him. But then I realized something. I didn't come here for him. I came here for me. And letting someone else's decisions determine my future was exactly the kind of thinking that got me into bad situations in the first place. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars above the Georgia pine trees. "Do you really think I should quit?" Audrey asked finally. "I think you should decide what you're really fighting for. Because if you're fighting to prove something to the drill sergeants, or to Rebecca Martinez, or even to your family back home, you're probably going to lose. But if you're fighting for yourself, for the person you want to become, that's a different battle entirely." The next morning brought a new challenge that would test every ounce of determination Audrey had left. The company was scheduled for their first extended field exercise, a 3-day training mission that would combine everything they'd learned so far into a realistic combat scenario. "Listen up, maggots," Drill Sergeant Torres announced during the pre-dawn briefing. "For the next 72 hours, you're going to live like soldiers in the field. You'll carry everything you need on your backs, you'll eat MREs, you'll sleep in fighting positions, and you'll complete objectives under combat conditions." He gestured to a topographical map showing their training area. "Your mission is to move 12 kilometers through enemy territory, establish an observation post, and hold it against simulated attacks while calling in support missions. Simple enough even for you people." What Torres didn't mention was that the 12-kilometer movement would be conducted with full combat loads, everything a soldier would carry in actual warfare. For most recruits, this meant a pack weighing between 60 and 70 pounds, plus weapons and additional equipment. For Audrey, it represented nearly 2/3 of her total body weight. The movement began at 0600 hours. Within the first kilometer, the company had stretched out into a long column, with stronger recruits setting the pace in front and slower ones struggling to keep up in the rear. Audrey found herself exactly where she'd expected, at the back, fighting to maintain contact with the main group. The pack felt like it was trying to drive her into the ground with each step. The shoulder straps cut into her collarbones, and the weight belt around her waist felt like it was compressing her internal organs. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, focusing only on the boots of the recruit ahead of her. By kilometer 3, her right ankle began to throb. By kilometer 5, she was limping noticeably. At kilometer 7, she fell for the first time, the weight of her pack driving her face first into the sandy Georgia soil. "Lopez is down," someone called out, and the entire column ground to a halt. Drill Sergeant Morgan appeared beside her as she struggled to get back to her feet. "What's the problem, recruit?" "Twisted ankle, Drill Sergeant." "I can keep going. Can you now?" Morgan examined her swollen ankle through her boot. "Looks like you're about to become a medical evacuation. That means the whole company fails the exercise." "No, Drill Sergeant. I can make it." "The hell you can. You can barely stand up." Tyler Richardson stepped forward from his position near the front of the formation. "Drill Sergeant, request permission to assist." "Negative, Richardson. This isn't a team-building exercise. Every soldier carries their own load." "But Drill Sergeant." "I said negative. Lopez either completes this movement on her own, or she doesn't complete it at all." What happened next surprised everyone, including Audrey herself. Despite the pain shooting up her leg with every step, despite the crushing weight of equipment that seemed designed for someone twice her size, despite the very reasonable option of accepting medical evacuation, she began walking again. "Lopez!" "Stop," Morgan commanded. "You're going to injure yourself permanently." "With respect, Drill Sergeant," Audrey replied, continuing to limp forward. "I came here to find out what I'm capable of. I haven't found that out yet." For the next 5 kilometers, Audrey redefined her understanding of what was possible. The pain became a constant companion that she learned to acknowledge but not surrender to. Her ankle screamed with every step, but she kept taking steps. Her pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but she kept carrying it. The other recruits began to take notice. At first, it was just curious glances back at the small figure limping determinedly at the rear of the formation. But as the hours passed and Audrey continued moving despite obvious agony, something shifted in the group dynamic. Jennifer began dropping back to check on her periodically. Marcus Williams started timing his water breaks to coincide with hers, offering quiet words of encouragement. Even Rebecca Martinez, who'd been the most vocal critic of Audrey's presence, seemed impressed by the display of stubborn determination. When they finally reached the objective area 12 hours later, Audrey collapsed immediately upon arrival. Her ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and blood from pack rub, and she was barely conscious from exhaustion and dehydration. But she had made it. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectations. She had completed the movement. Drill Sergeant Morgan knelt beside her as the company medic examined her ankle. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why put yourself through that when you could have taken the medical evacuation?" Audrey looked up at her, through eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Because I needed to know," she whispered. "Know what?" "That I could." As the medic wrapped her ankle and declared it sprained, but not broken, Audrey realized something had fundamentally changed. She'd found her breaking point, and then kept going past it. The physical pain would heal, but the knowledge that she could endure more than she'd ever imagined possible would stay with her forever. She still had weeks of training ahead of her, still had obstacles to overcome and standards to meet. But lying there in the Georgia dirt, surrounded by fellow recruits who were looking at her with something approaching respect, Audrey Lopez began to understand what it truly meant to be a soldier. The sprained ankle should have been the end of Audrey's military career. Medical protocol dictated at least 2 weeks of limited duty, which in basic training terms meant automatic recycling to a new company and starting the entire process over again. But as Audrey lay in the base medical facility that night, wrapped in blankets and hooked to an IV for dehydration, an unexpected visitor changed everything. Command Sergeant Major Patricia Hayes entered the medical bay at 2100 hours. Her presence immediately commanding attention from every medical staff member in the facility. At 45, Hayes was a legend at Fort Benning, a career soldier who'd served in 3 combat deployments and was known for her ability to identify potential in the most unlikely recruits. "Lopez," she said, approaching Audrey's bed with measured steps. "Command Sergeant Major." Audrey attempted to sit up straighter despite the pain. "At ease, recruit. I hear you had an interesting day." "Yes, Command Sergeant Major." Hayes pulled up a chair, settling in with the deliberate manner of someone who had important things to discuss. "I've been watching your progress. Or lack thereof, depending on how you look at it." Audrey felt her heart sink. This was it, the official conversation about discharge, about how she'd given it her best effort, but wasn't cut out for military life. "Your PT scores are substandard," Hayes continued. "Your obstacle course times are among the worst in company history. You've required medical attention twice in 3 weeks." She paused, studying Audrey's face. "And yet, 3 drill sergeants have come to me separately to discuss your case." "Command Sergeant Major?" "Drill Sergeant Torres tells me you're the most accurate marksman in your company. Drill Sergeant Morgan says you've never missed a single training evolution, never failed to complete a task, regardless of how long it took you. And Drill Sergeant Williams from Alpha Company says your performance during today's field exercise was the most impressive display of determination he's witnessed in 15 years of training recruits." Audrey blinked in surprise. She hadn't even known Drill Sergeant Williams was observing their exercise. "Here's what I'm going to offer you," Hayes said, leaning forward. "Instead of recycling you to a new company, I'm going to put you in a specialized training program we run for recruits who show exceptional potential in non-traditional areas. It's called the Leadership Development Track. I don't understand, Command Sergeant Major. Lopez, the Army doesn't just need soldiers who can run fast and do push-ups. We need soldiers who can think under pressure, who can inspire others through their actions, who can find ways to accomplish the mission when conventional methods fail. Hayes stood up. What you did today, completing that movement on a sprained ankle when you could have taken the easy way out, that's leadership. Raw, unpolished leadership, but leadership nonetheless. The leadership development track turned out to be unlike anything Audrey had expected. Instead of repeating basic training with a new company, she was assigned to a small group of 8 recruits who'd been identified as having unique potential. The program was run by Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a soft-spoken infantryman who'd earned his reputation not through intimidation, but through expertise. Forget everything you think you know about military training, Rodriguez told the group on their first day. This isn't about who can do the most push-ups or run the fastest mile. This is about developing the kind of thinking that makes good soldiers into great leaders. The group was diverse in ways that traditional basic training companies rarely were. There was David Kim, a computer programmer from Seattle who'd struggled with physical training but demonstrated exceptional analytical abilities. Maria Santos from El Paso had failed the initial PT test but showed remarkable composure under stress. James Carter from Detroit had been on the verge of discharge for attitude problems but displayed natural leadership abilities that his drill sergeants couldn't ignore. And then there was Audrey, the small girl from East LA who couldn't climb a rope but had just walked 12 kilometers on a sprained ankle. Because quitting wasn't an option, the training methodology was completely different. Instead of mass punishment and constant stress, Rodriguez focused on individual development and critical thinking. Physical fitness remained important, but it was balanced with tactical problem-solving, leadership scenarios, and detailed analysis of what made effective soldiers. Lopez, Rodriguez said during her first one-on-one evaluation session, "I've reviewed your file. Your physical limitations are obvious, but they're not insurmountable. The question is, how do we develop your strengths while addressing your weaknesses?" "I'm willing to work on anything, Staff Sergeant. That's exactly the right attitude. But I want you to think bigger than just personal improvement. How do you use what you're learning to help others?" The answer came during a training exercise designed to test problem-solving under pressure. The scenario involved a simulated patrol that had encountered casualties and needed to establish a casualty collection point while under enemy fire. The group had to work together to treat wounded, maintain security, and coordinate evacuation. Audrey found herself naturally falling into the role of coordinator. While the physically stronger recruits focused on moving casualties and establishing defensive positions, she positioned herself at the center of the action, gathering information, making decisions, and ensuring that every team member understood their role. "Carter, I need you to move Rodriguez to cover behind that barrier," she called out during the exercise. "Santos, establish overwatch from the elevated position. Kim, get on the radio and coordinate with the evacuation team." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched from the sidelines as the small recruit, who couldn't do 30 push-ups, effectively commanded a team of soldiers through a complex tactical scenario. When the exercise ended, he gathered the group for after-action review. "What did everyone observe about leadership during this exercise?" he asked. David Kim spoke first. Lopez took charge naturally, but she didn't just give orders. She made sure everyone understood why they were doing what they were doing. She used everyone's strengths, Maria Santos added. Put Carter in the physical role, had me take the shooting position, gave Kim the technical task. And most importantly, James Carter concluded, she stayed calm when everything was chaotic, made decisions fast but didn't panic. Rodriguez nodded. "Lopez, what did you learn?" That leadership isn't about being the biggest or strongest person, Audrey replied. It's about understanding the mission, understanding your people, and finding ways to connect those two things effectively. Outstanding answer. And how does that apply to your own development? For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Audrey felt a sense of clarity about her path forward. It means I need to stop focusing on competing with people who are naturally better at physical tasks and start focusing on developing the skills that I can be exceptional at. The next 6 weeks of the leadership development track transformed not just Audrey's approach to military training, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. The physical training continued, but it was supplemented with coursework in military history, tactical analysis, and leadership theory. Under Rodriguez's guidance, Audrey began to see patterns in successful military operations that had nothing to do with individual physical prowess and everything to do with intelligent planning, effective communication, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. She studied cases like the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off a massive Persian army not through superior numbers, but through superior tactics and unwavering determination. She analyzed modern special operations missions where small teams accomplished objectives that conventional forces couldn't handle through careful planning and exceptional teamwork. Most importantly, she began to understand that her own struggles at Fort Benning were teaching her lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. Every great leader has been broken down and built back up, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez explained during one of their evening sessions. The question isn't whether you'll face obstacles, it's how you'll respond to them and what you'll learn from the experience. The culminating exercise of the leadership development track was a week-long field training exercise where each recruit would take turns leading the team through increasingly complex scenarios. When Audrey's turn came, she was assigned the most challenging scenario yet, a simulated hostage rescue mission that required coordinating with multiple units while working under severe time constraints. As she briefed her team on the mission parameters, Audrey realized that everything she'd learned over the past 2 months was coming together. Her attention to detail, developed through months of struggling with basic tasks, allowed her to spot potential problems in the plan. Her understanding of each team member's capabilities, learned through shared adversity, enabled her to assign roles effectively. And her hard-won knowledge that persistence could overcome almost any obstacle gave her the confidence to make decisive choices under pressure. The mission was a complete success. More importantly, it demonstrated to everyone involved, including Audrey herself, that leadership came in many forms, and that some of the most effective leaders were those who'd learned to overcome their own limitations. On graduation day, from the leadership development track, Command Sergeant Major Hayes addressed the small group of recruits who'd completed the program. "You 8 soldiers represent something special," she said. "You've proven that military excellence isn't about fitting a predetermined mold. It's about finding ways to contribute to the mission using whatever unique capabilities you possess." She turned to look directly at Audrey. "Lopez, when you arrived at Fort Benning, multiple people suggested you didn't belong here. I want you to know that you've not only proven them wrong, you've demonstrated the kind of leadership potential that the Army desperately needs." As Audrey stood at attention, receiving her certificate of completion, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she'd been a small girl from East LA who couldn't do 30 push-ups. Today, she was a soldier who understood that true strength came not from what your body could do, but from what your mind could accomplish and what your heart could endure. But the most important lesson was still ahead of her. As she prepared to move on to advanced individual training, Audrey had no idea that her real test of leadership was waiting just around the corner, and that everything she'd learned about overcoming obstacles was about to be put to the ultimate test. 6 months after graduating from basic training, Private First Class Audrey Lopez arrived at Fort Gordon, Georgia, for advanced individual training in military intelligence. The transition from the structured environment of basic training to the more autonomous world of specialized military education represented a new set of challenges that would test everything she'd learned about herself. The military intelligence school was a different world entirely. Gone were the constant screaming drill sergeants and mass punishment exercises. Instead, Audrey found herself in classrooms studying cryptography, signal analysis, and strategic assessment with instructors who treated the students more like college pupils than basic trainees. Her first roommate was Specialist Jessica Thompson, a 23-year-old from Portland who'd been in the Army for 2 years and was cross-training into intelligence work. Jessica took one look at Audrey's small frame and baby face and immediately assumed she was dealing with a typical new soldier who'd barely survived basic training. "Let me guess," Jessica said as Audrey unpacked her gear. "You got pushed into me because you couldn't hack it in combat arms?" "Something like that," Audrey replied, not bothering to correct the assumption. She'd learned that proving herself through actions was more effective than trying to explain her background. The academic rigor of the intelligence program was unlike anything Audrey had experienced. The coursework involved complex analytical processes, foreign language fundamentals, and detailed study of international security issues. For the first time since joining the Army, physical fitness took a backseat to mental agility. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the primary instructor for strategic analysis, set the tone during the first class session. "Ladies and gentlemen, intelligence work is about seeing patterns that others miss, asking questions that others don't think to ask, and making connections that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." She gestured to a complex diagram showing various data streams and analytical frameworks. "Your job isn't to be the strongest soldier or the fastest runner. Your job is to be smarter than the enemy, more thorough than your predecessors, and more insightful than conventional wisdom would suggest." For Audrey, this environment was revelatory. After months of being judged primarily on physical capabilities, she found herself in a setting where her natural analytical abilities and attention to detail were not just welcomed but essential. The first major challenge came during a simulated intelligence analysis exercise. Students were given a collection of seemingly unrelated information: intercepted communications, satellite imagery, personnel movement reports, and economic data, and tasked with identifying potential security threats. Most students approached the problem systematically, working through each data stream individually before attempting to draw connections. Audrey took a different approach, immediately looking for anomalies and patterns that didn't fit expected norms. "Thompson," she said to her roommate during the exercise, "look at this communication intercept from 3 days ago. The sender mentions a family gathering, but uses a specific date format that doesn't match the cultural norm for that region." Jessica looked at the document Audrey was highlighting. "Maybe it's just a translation error?" "Maybe, but look at this satellite image. From the same day. There's unusual vehicle movement near what's supposed to be a civilian compound, and the timing corresponds exactly with the communication." As Audrey continued building her analysis, she began to see a pattern emerging. The family gathering was likely code for an operational meeting. The vehicle movement suggested preparation for a significant operation, and the economic data showed unusual cash flows in the region that could indicate funding for hostile activities. When time was called, each student presented their findings to Captain Mitchell and a panel of instructors. Most presentations focused on individual data points and general threat assessments. When Audrey's turn came, she laid out a comprehensive analysis that connected seemingly unrelated information into a coherent intelligence picture. Based on the convergence of communication patterns, logistical movement, and financial indicators, she concluded, "I assess with high confidence that hostile forces are planning a significant operation in Sector 7 within the next 72 hours, likely targeting coalition supply routes. The room was silent for a moment. Then Captain Mitchell smiled. "Outstanding analysis, Private Lopez. You've just identified what our actual intelligence teams took 3 weeks to figure out during a real-world operation in Afghanistan. The success in the classroom translated into increased responsibility and recognition from instructors. Audrey was selected for advanced coursework normally reserved for senior enlisted personnel and officers. She found herself studying alongside sergeants and staff sergeants who had years of experience but recognized her analytical abilities. But success in the academic environment brought new challenges. Some of her fellow students began to resent what they perceived as special treatment. Others questioned whether someone so young and inexperienced should be given access to advanced training opportunities. The tension came to a head during a field training exercise designed to simulate real-world intelligence gathering operations. Students were divided into teams and given missions that required both analytical skills and practical application of intelligence techniques. Audrey was assigned to a team led by Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, a veteran intelligence analyst who'd served multiple deployments and clearly had reservations about working with junior personnel. "Listen up," Martinez told his team during the initial briefing. "This exercise is graded, and our performance reflects on everyone. I don't want any heroes or anyone trying to prove how smart they are. Follow the established procedures and let experience guide the mission." The team's assignment involved conducting surveillance of a simulated enemy compound and providing real-time intelligence assessments to support a planned operation. Standard procedure called for establishing observation posts at predetermined locations and following a rigid reporting schedule. But as Audrey studied the terrain and mission parameters, she identified a significant problem with the standard approach. "Sergeant Martinez," she said during the planning phase, "the predetermined observation posts provide limited visibility of the target area. If we adjust positions by approximately 200 meters north, we could improve coverage by 30% and reduce the risk of detection." Martinez's expression hardened. "Private, the observation posts were selected by experienced personnel based on proven tactics. We're not changing the plan because a trainee thinks she knows better." "I understand, Sergeant. I'm just pointing out that the terrain features have changed since the standard positions were established. Recent construction has blocked some sight lines. The plan stands as briefed." What followed was a textbook demonstration of why rigid adherence to doctrine without consideration of changing circumstances could lead to mission failure. The team established their observation posts according to the standard plan and immediately discovered that their visibility was severely limited by the construction Audrey had identified. As the exercise progressed, they missed critical movement in and around the target compound. Their intelligence reports were incomplete and in some cases inaccurate. When the simulated operation was conducted based on their assessments, it resulted in a tactical failure that could have meant casualties in a real-world scenario. The after-action review. The exercise controllers highlighted the intelligence failures that had contributed to the mission's poor outcome. The observation team failed to adapt to changing circumstances, the lead controller noted. They relied on outdated planning assumptions instead of conducting proper reconnaissance and adjusting their positions accordingly. Sergeant Martinez looked uncomfortable as the criticism continued, but he maintained his composure until one of the instructors asked a direct question. "Sergeant Martinez, did anyone on your team identify the visibility problems during planning?" Martinez hesitated, then nodded. "Private Lopez raised concerns about the observation post locations, but I determined that sticking with established procedures was the appropriate course of action." "And what was Private Lopez's recommended solution?" "She suggested adjusting positions to improve visibility and reduce detection risk." The instructor turned to Audrey. "Private Lopez, walk us through your assessment." Audrey stood and approached the terrain model, pointing out the construction features that had blocked critical sight lines and explaining how alternative positions would have provided better intelligence gathering capabilities. When she finished, the lead instructor addressed the entire class. This exercise demonstrates a critical lesson about intelligence work. Doctrine and established procedures provide a foundation, but effective intelligence professionals must be able to adapt when circumstances change. Rigid thinking gets people killed. He looked directly at Martinez. Sergeant, experience is valuable, but it becomes a liability when it prevents you from seeing new solutions to changing problems. After the exercise, Martinez approached Audrey privately. His initial hostility had been replaced by something that looked like grudging respect. "Lopez, I owe you an apology. I let my ego get in the way of good judgment, and the team paid the price." "No apology necessary, Sergeant. I'm still learning how to communicate my assessments effectively." "No, you communicated just fine. I chose not to listen." He paused. "For what it's worth, your analysis was spot on. In a real-world situation, that kind of thinking could save lives." The incident marked a turning point in how Audrey was perceived by her peers and instructors. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit intelligence community about the young private who'd identified a critical flaw in established doctrine and proposed an effective solution. Captain Mitchell called her in for a private consultation the following week. "Lopez, I've been watching your progress since you arrived here. Your analytical abilities are exceptional, but more importantly, you have the courage to challenge conventional thinking when the situation demands it." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm recommending you for accelerated promotion and assignment to a specialized intelligence unit upon graduation. You'll be working with some of the most experienced analysts in the Army, dealing with real-world intelligence challenges." Audrey felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. "What kind of assignment, ma'am?" "Counterintelligence work. High-level threat assessment. The kind of work where analytical mistakes have strategic consequences." Mitchell leaned forward. "It's also the kind of work where fresh perspectives and independent thinking are absolutely critical." As Audrey left Captain Mitchell's office, she reflected on how much had changed since those first terrifying days at Fort Benning. The small girl who couldn't climb a rope had become a soldier whose analytical abilities were being recognized at the highest levels. But she also understood that each new level of responsibility brought greater challenges and higher stakes. Intelligence world was unforgiving of mistakes, and the enemies she'd be analyzing were sophisticated, resourceful, and dedicated to causing harm to American interests. As she prepared for graduation from the military intelligence school, Audrey knew that her real education was just beginning. The academic exercises and simulated scenarios had taught her the fundamentals, but soon she'd be dealing with real threats, real consequences, and the weight of decisions that could affect national security. The girl who'd been told she'd never survive boot camp was about to enter a world where intellectual courage and analytical precision would be tested against some of the most dangerous adversaries in the world. 18 months after graduating from the military intelligence school, Sergeant Audrey Lopez found herself in a classified briefing room at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, staring at intelligence reports that could change the course of American military operations in 3 different countries. At 24, she was the youngest member of the Joint Intelligence Analysis Cell, a position that placed her at the center of some of the most sensitive national security decisions being made by the U.S. military. The promotion to sergeant had come faster than anyone expected, including Audrey herself. Her analytical work had contributed to the successful identification of 2 major terrorist financing networks and the prevention of what intelligence agencies assessed would have been significant attack on American interests overseas. But success in the intelligence world came with a price: increased responsibility, higher security clearances, and the constant weight of knowing that analytical mistakes could cost lives. Her current assignment involved analyzing intelligence related to a growing insurgency in a strategically important region where American forces were conducting training missions with allied governments. The insurgents had demonstrated increasingly sophisticated tactics and appeared to have access to advanced weapons and communications equipment that suggested external support. Lopez called Colonel David Harrison, the commanding officer of the Joint Intelligence Analysis Cell. "I need your assessment of the Patterson Report by 1400 hours." The Patterson Report was a comprehensive intelligence analysis prepared by a team of senior analysts from multiple agencies. It concluded that the insurgency was primarily domestically funded and organized, with limited external support. The report recommended continuing current operations with minor tactical adjustments. Audrey had been studying the report for 3 days, and something didn't feel right. The conclusion seemed sound on the surface, but when she dug deeper into the supporting data, she found inconsistencies that troubled her. "Sir," she said, approaching Colonel Harrison's office, "I need to discuss some concerns about the Patterson analysis." Harrison looked up from his computer, his expression suggesting this wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "What kind of concerns?" "The financial flow analysis doesn't support the conclusions about domestic funding. The insurgents are operating at a level that requires resources beyond what local sources could provide." "Sergeant, this report was prepared by some of the most experienced analysts in the intelligence community. Are you suggesting they missed something obvious?" "Not obvious, sir. But I think they may have overlooked some subtle indicators that suggest a different picture." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Show me." For the next 30 minutes, Audrey walked through her analysis, pointing out discrepancies in financial data, anomalies in communications patterns, and logistical capabilities that didn't match the assessed level of domestic support. She demonstrated how seemingly minor inconsistencies, when viewed together, suggested a sophisticated external support network that was working hard to remain invisible. "If I'm right," she concluded, "the current operational approach isn't adequate to address the actual threat. The insurgents have capabilities and resources that our forces aren't prepared to counter." Colonel Harrison studied the materials Audrey had prepared. "This is a serious allegation, Sergeant. If you're correct, it means a multi-agency intelligence assessment involving dozens of experienced analysts reached fundamentally wrong conclusions." "Yes, sir. And if you're wrong, it means you're second-guessing people with decades more experience than you have." "I understand that, sir, but the data supports my assessment." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to give you 48 hours to prepare a comprehensive counter-analysis. If you can build a convincing case, I'll take it up the chain. But Sergeant, you'd better be absolutely certain about this. Challenging a major intelligence assessment isn't something we do lightly." The next 48 hours were the most intense of Audrey's military career. She worked 18-hour days, carefully documenting every piece of evidence that supported her alternative analysis. She reached out to contacts in various intelligence agencies, requesting additional data and clarification on analytical methodologies. She even called in favors from former instructors who had connections to specialized analytical resources. What emerged was a detailed picture of a sophisticated insurgency with significant external support, advanced training, and access to military-grade equipment and intelligence. The domestic funding sources identified in the Patterson Report appeared to be deliberate misdirection, designed to conceal the true scope and nature of external involvement. Most troubling was her assessment that current American forces in the region were inadequately prepared for the level of threat they were actually facing. Equipment, tactics, and force protection measures were based on the assumption of a locally organized insurgency with limited capabilities. If Audrey's analysis was correct, American personnel were in significantly more danger than anyone realized. When she presented her findings to Colonel Harrison, his expression grew increasingly serious. This is thorough work, Sergeant. And frankly, it's disturbing. If your assessment is accurate, we have American soldiers operating under false assumptions about the threats they're facing. That's my primary concern, sir. The tactical implications are significant. Harrison picked up his secure phone. I'm scheduling an emergency briefing with the regional command staff. You'll be presenting this analysis to some very senior people who aren't going to appreciate having their previous assessments challenged. The briefing took place in a secure conference room at U.S. Southern Command Headquarters. Audrey found herself facing a panel that included 2 general officers, multiple colonels, and senior representatives from various intelligence agencies, including several of the analysts who had prepared the original Patterson report. Major General Patricia Williams, the deputy commander, opened the session with a pointed question. Sergeant Lopez, I understand you have concerns about our current intelligence assessments regarding the insurgency situation. Before we proceed, I want to be clear about what you're alleging. Ma'am, I'm not alleging anything. I'm presenting an alternative analysis based on the same data used in the Patterson report, plus additional information that became available subsequently. And your analysis contradicts the conclusions reached by a team of senior intelligence professionals? Yes. MAAM. I believe the threat assessment is significantly understated. For the next hour, Audrey presented her findings with the same methodical precision she'd learned during her intelligence training. She walked through financial flows, communications analysis, weapons capabilities assessment, and operational patterns that suggested a much more sophisticated and well-supported insurgency than previously assessed. The questions came fast and challenging. Senior analysts pushed back on her methodology, questioned her sources, and suggested that her inexperience was leading her to see patterns that didn't actually exist. But Audrey had anticipated the pushback and prepared accordingly. For every challenge, she had supporting data. For every alternative explanation, she had evidence that supported her assessment. Most importantly, she remained calm and professional, even when the questioning became intense. The turning point came when she presented intercepts of insurgent communications that had been dismissed as routine in the original analysis. These communications use code phrases and operational security measures that require sophisticated training. She explained, "This isn't the kind of tradecraft you develop through trial and error. It suggests professional military or intelligence training." One of the Patterson report authors, Dr. Michael Stevens from the Defense Intelligence Agency, spoke up. "Sergeant, those communications could be explained by the insurgents learning from captured materials or online resources. That was my initial assessment as well, Dr. Stevens. But when you analyze the progression of their communication security over time, it shows systematic improvement consistent with ongoing professional training, not self-taught methods." She displayed a timeline showing the evolution of insurgent communications techniques. Notice how they progressed from basic code words to sophisticated frequency-hopping patterns in just 6 months. That kind of development curve requires expert instruction. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Audrey was right, it meant the insurgents had access to professional military training, which suggested state-level support rather than purely domestic organization. General Williams leaned forward. "Sergeant Lopez, what are your recommendations regarding force protection and operational adjustments?" "Ma'am, I recommend immediate enhancement of force protection measures for all American personnel in the region. Updated threat briefings based on revised capability assessments and tactical adjustments to counter more sophisticated improvised explosive devices and ambush techniques. Timeline for implementation?" "Immediately, ma'am. If my assessment is correct, current force protection measures are inadequate for the actual threat level." After Audrey was dismissed from the briefing, she waited outside for what felt like hours. Through the classified conference room windows, She could see animated discussions among the senior officers and analysts. Occasionally, someone would point to her analysis materials or gesture emphatically while making a point. Finally, Colonel Harrison emerged from the conference room. His expression was unreadable. "Sergeant, they've accepted your analysis. Emergency force protection measures are being implemented immediately, and operational plans are being revised based on your threat assessment." Audrey felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Sir, I hope I'm wrong about the threat level." "So do I, Sergeant. But if you're right, you may have just saved a lot of American lives." 3 weeks later, validation of Audrey's analysis came. In the most dramatic way possible. An insurgent attack on an American training facility demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated tactics and advanced weaponry that her assessment had predicted. Because force protection measures had been enhanced based on her recommendations, casualties were significantly reduced from what they would have been under the original threat assessment. The successful prediction established Audrey's reputation within the intelligence community as an analyst whose insights could identify threats that others missed. But it also marked her as someone willing to challenge conventional wisdom when the evidence supported different conclusions, a reputation that would define the rest of her military career. As she prepared for her next assignment, Audrey understood that she'd crossed a threshold. She was no longer the small girl who'd struggled through basic training, or even the promising student who'd excelled in intelligence school. She was a professional intelligence analyst whose judgments could influence major military operations and affect the safety of American personnel worldwide. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and motivating. Every analysis she produced, every assessment she made, every recommendation she offered could have real-world consequences for real people in dangerous situations. But as she'd learned during those first, terrifying weeks at Fort Benning, responsibility wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be earned, embraced, and executed with the highest possible standards of professionalism and dedication. 2 years after her breakthrough analysis that had prevented casualties in 3 separate theaters, Staff Sergeant Audrey Lopez stood in front of a classroom filled with fresh-faced recruits at the Defense Intelligence Agency's training facility in Virginia. At 26, she was about to begin the most challenging assignment of her career, transforming civilians into intelligence analysts, capable of making life-and-death decisions. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd been told she was too small, too weak, and too emotional for military service was now responsible for training the next generation of America's intelligence professionals. "Good morning," she said, surveying the 43 students arranged in neat rows before her. "My name is Staff Sergeant Lopez, and for the next 16 weeks, I'll be your primary instructor in advanced threat assessment and strategic analysis." She paused, noting the mix of expressions, some confident, others nervous, all trying to project competence they didn't yet possess. "Before we begin, I want to establish something. Intelligence work isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to ask uncomfortable questions, challenge popular assumptions, and accept responsibility for conclusions that could affect thousands of lives." Among the students, she noticed a young woman in the 3rd row who seemed familiar not in appearance, but in attitude. Private Second Class Maria Gonzalez sat rigidly upright, her notebook perfectly aligned, her uniform immaculate despite being clearly too large for her small frame. She had the look of someone desperately trying to prove she belonged. After class, Audrey approached Gonzalez's desk. "Private, a word?" Maria jumped to attention. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. At ease. I noticed you took extensive notes during today's session. Mind if I ask about your background?" "Staff Sergeant, I have a degree in International Relations from UCLA. I speak 3 languages fluently and scored in the 98th percentile on the Intelligence Aptitude Assessment." Audrey smiled. The response was technically accurate, but revealed nothing about the person behind the credentials. Impressive, but that's not what I asked. I want to know about you, why you're here, what drives you. Maria's composure faltered. Slightly, I want to serve my country, Staff Sergeant. And I want to prove that someone like me can succeed in this field. Someone like you. Someone who's been underestimated her entire life. The honesty in that statement hit Audrey like a physical blow. She saw herself 5 years earlier determined, afraid, carrying the weight of everyone else's doubts along with her own. Walk with me, Audrey said. They left the classroom building and strolled across the manicured campus of the training facility. The Virginia afternoon was crisp, autumn leaves crunching under their boots. Tell me about being underestimated. Audrey said. Maria was quiet for a moment. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. When I told my parents I was joining the Army, they thought I was throwing my education away. When I told my professors I was going into intelligence work, they suggested I reconsider civilian opportunities that would be more suitable for someone of my background. And what background is that? First-generation American. Parents who work in agriculture. Someone who should be grateful for whatever opportunities come along, instead of reaching for something that might be above my station. Audrey nodded, understanding the weight of those expectations. What made you decide to reach anyway, honestly? I got tired of other people deciding what I was capable of. I figured the worst thing that could happen was failing while trying to do something meaningful. They had reached a small courtyard, with benches arranged around a memorial honoring intelligence professionals who had died in service. Audrey gestured for Maria to sit. I'm going to tell you something that's not in any manual, Audrey said. The most dangerous thing about this job isn't foreign adversaries or classified information. It's the temptation to become what other people expect you to be instead of discovering what you're actually capable of. Over the following weeks, Audrey watched Maria navigate the complex world of intelligence, training with a mixture of determination and self-doubt that felt achingly familiar. The coursework was demanding strategic analysis, threat assessment, cultural intelligence, and psychological profiling. Maria excelled academically, but struggled with the confidence to assert her own analytical judgments. The problem became clear during a practical exercise involving terrorist threat assessment. Students were divided into teams and given real-world scenarios based on declassified intelligence. Maria's team was tasked with analyzing chatter suggesting a potential attack on transportation infrastructure in a major American city. As the team leader, Senior Airman Robert Chang led the discussion. Maria sat quietly taking notes despite having insights that could have significantly improved their analysis. The communication pattern suggests coordination between 3 separate cells, Chang explained to the group. Standard protocol would be to focus surveillance on known associates of previously identified suspects. Maria raised her hand tentatively. Senior Airman Chang, what if the coordination isn't between separate cells, but rather different phases of the same operation? The timing interval suggests sequential planning rather than parallel development. Chang dismissed her observation with barely concealed impatience. Private Gonzalez, you're overthinking this. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. But Audrey, observing from the back of the room, recognized the analytical pattern Maria had identified. When the exercise concluded, the instructor panel revealed that Maria's interpretation had been correct. The intelligence indicated a single, sophisticated operation designed to look like multiple unrelated threats. Chang's team received a failing grade, while teams that had pursued similar lines of reasoning to Maria's were commended for their analytical insight. After class, Audrey found Maria sitting alone in the student lounge, staring at her notes with frustration. Tough day? Audrey asked, settling into the chair across from her. I knew I was right about the coordination patterns, Maria said quietly. But when Chang shot down my analysis, I just went along with it. Why? Because he has more experience. Because he's senior in rank. Because I thought maybe I was being presumptuous. Audrey leaned forward. Maria, can I share something with you? When I was going through basic training, I failed almost every physical standard. I was told repeatedly that I didn't belong, that I was holding everyone back, that I should quit and find something more suited to my limitations. Maria looked up with surprise. But you're one of the most respected analysts in the intelligence community. I read about your work on the insurgency assessment. That's exactly my point. The people who told me I wasn't cut out for military service weren't necessarily wrong about my physical limitations, but they were completely wrong about what those limitations meant for my potential contribution. She gestured toward Maria's notebook, filled with detailed observations and analytical frameworks. Your insight about the coordination patterns was brilliant. It demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking that prevents terrorist attacks. But if you don't have the confidence to fight for your assessments, that brilliance is worthless. So, what do I do? Challenge every senior person who disagrees with me. No. You learn to distinguish between times when you should defer to experience and times when you need to trust your own judgment. And you develop the professional skills too. Advocate for your position effectively. The next practical exercise provided an opportunity to test that advice. This time, the scenario involved cyber threats against critical infrastructure. Maria's team was assigned to assess the likelihood that various attack vectors could be successfully exploited by hostile actors. When the team discussion began, Maria came prepared. She had researched not just the technical aspects of the potential attacks, but also the historical patterns of how similar threats had evolved in real-world situations. Based on the timeline of previous cyber campaigns, she told her team, I assess that the most likely attack vector isn't the obvious target everyone's focusing on. The communication pattern suggests this is a probe designed to draw attention away from the real objective. This time, when Senior Airman Chang questioned her assessment, Maria was ready. I understand the concern about overcomplicating the analysis, she replied. But look at the resource allocation patterns in the intelligence. They're investing too much in probing defenses that would be relatively easy to attack if that was the real objective. It suggests misdirection. She presented her evidence methodically, connecting data points that others had dismissed as unrelated. The team ultimately adopted her analytical framework, and their assessment proved to be the most accurate of any group in the exercise. But the real test came during the final capstone exercise, comprehensive threat assessment that would determine each student's suitability for assignment to operational intelligence units. Maria was assigned to analyze intelligence suggesting a complex plot involving multiple threat vectors across several countries. The scenario was based on actual intelligence that had challenged professional analysts for months before being resolved. As she worked through the massive amount of data, Maria found herself overwhelmed by the complexity and competing theories about what the intelligence actually meant. Different pieces of evidence seemed to support contradictory conclusions, and the pressure of the final assessment made it difficult to think clearly. With 12 hours remaining before her presentation, she approached Audrey's office. Staff Sergeant, I need help. I can't make sense of this intelligence picture. Everything I think I understand gets contradicted by something else in the data. Audrey invited her in and closed the door. Tell me what you're seeing. For the next hour, Maria walked through her analysis, explaining the various theories she'd considered and the evidence that both supported and contradicted each one. I feel like I'm missing something obvious, Maria concluded. Like there's a pattern right in front of me that I'm not seeing. Maybe you're not missing anything, Audrey replied. Maybe the pattern you're not seeing is that there isn't a single pattern. What if the complexity you're struggling with is the actual nature of the threat? Maria stared at her notes, suddenly seeing the intelligence picture from a different perspective. You mean, what if the contradictory evidence isn't a flaw in my analysis, but rather the intended result of the sophisticated deception operation. What does the evidence tell you? Over the next several hours, Maria developed an assessment that characterized the intelligence not as a single threat, but as a deliberate campaign to create analytical confusion. Her conclusion was that hostile actors were deliberately generating contradictory intelligence to overwhelm analytical resources and mask their actual operations. When she presented her findings the next morning, the panel of instructors listened with growing attention. Her assessment challenged not just the obvious interpretations of the intelligence, but the fundamental assumption that all the data related to a single threat scenario. "Private Gonzalez," said Colonel Matthews, the senior instructor, "your analysis suggests that experienced intelligence professionals have been chasing shadows for months, while the real threat operated undetected." "Yes, sir, that's exactly what I'm suggesting." The room fell silent. Then Colonel Matthews smiled. "Outstanding work. Your assessment matches the actual resolution of this case, which took a team of senior analysts 8 months to reach." After the presentation, as students filed out to await their final grades and assignments, Maria approached Audrey. "Staff Sergeant, I wanted to thank you, not just for the instruction, but for teaching me to trust my own judgment." "You taught yourself that," Audrey replied. "I just helped you recognize what you were already capable of." A week later, Maria received orders assigning her to one of the most prestigious analytical positions available to junior intelligence personnel, a role typically reserved for analysts with years of experience. As Audrey watched her former student pack her belongings and prepare to leave for her new assignment, she reflected on what she'd learned about leadership and mentorship. The most important thing she could teach wasn't analytical techniques or procedural knowledge. It was the confidence to trust their own capabilities and the courage to advocate for their professional judgments. Standing in the empty classroom after her students had graduated, Audrey thought about her own journey from the recruit who couldn't climb a rope to the instructor who was now helping shape the next generation of intelligence professionals. But even as she celebrated Maria's success and reflected on her own growth, Audrey knew that her most challenging test as a leader was still ahead. Word had come down that she was being considered for a position that would take her full circle, returning to Fort Benning as a drill instructor, responsible for training basic combat soldiers, the small girl who'd been told she'd never survive. Boot camp was about to become the person who decided which recruits had what it took to become soldiers. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured parade grounds of Fort Mitchell as Staff Sergeant Audrey Lopez stood at attention. Her uniform crisp and immaculate despite the Georgia humidity. At 28, she commanded respect from recruits twice her size with nothing more than a glance. But what those wide-eyed teenagers didn't know was that just 5 years earlier, their drill instructor had been told she'd never make it past week 1 of basic training. The assignment had come as a surprise, even to Audrey. After 3 years as one of the Army's most successful intelligence analysts, she'd expected to continue climbing the ranks within the intelligence community. Instead, she'd been hand-selected for the Drill Sergeant School at Fort Mora, program that would transform her from someone who analyzed threats to someone who created soldiers capable of facing them. Lopez, Command Sergeant Major Patricia Hayes, had said during their final meeting at the Pentagon, "We need drill instructors who understand that strength comes in many forms. Your job won't be to make everyone physically identical. It'll be to help each recruit discover their own path to excellence." Now, as Audrey watched the buses pull up to discharge the newest group of recruits, she felt the weight of that responsibility. 47 young Americans, men and women from every conceivable background, were about to begin the most challenging 10 weeks of their lives under her guidance. The first bus disgorged its cargo of nervous civilians clutching duffel bags and trying to remember everything they'd been told about military bearing. Audrey studied each face, automatically cataloging signs of determination, fear, overconfidence, and hidden potential. Her eyes stopped on a young man near the back of the group. Private recruit David Kim was barely 18, maybe 5'4", on a good day, with the kind of slight build that suggested he'd spent more time with computers than with weights. His uniform hung awkwardly, and he struggled under the weight of his gear. Most tellingly, he had the expression of someone who was already questioning whether he'd made a terrible mistake. "Find a footprint and shut your mouths." Audrey's voice carried across the formation area with an authority that would have surprised anyone who'd known her 5 years earlier. "You are nitrogen monoxide longer civilians. You are nitrogen monoxide longer special. You are the raw material from which we will forge United States soldiers." The recruits scrambled to find positions on the yellow footprints painted on the concrete, the same footprints where Audrey herself had once stood, terrified and overwhelmed. The circle was complete, but with one crucial difference: she now understood what the process was truly designed to accomplish. As the initial formation and administrative processing continued, Audrey found herself paying particular attention to the recruits who reminded her of herself. There was David Kim, obviously, but also private recruit Jessica Martinez, a young woman from rural Montana who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, and private recruit Marcus Thompson, whose confident facade couldn't quite hide the uncertainty beneath. The first physical training session revealed exactly what Audrey had expected. The usual suspects excelled: former high school athletes, kids who'd grown up doing manual labor, natural competitors who thrived under pressure. But it was the struggles that caught her attention. David Kim collapsed during push-ups at 15 repetitions, exactly where Audrey had failed years earlier. Jessica Martinez finished the mile run nearly 5 minutes over the minimum standard. Marcus Thompson, despite his confident attitude, clearly had never been challenged physically in his life, and was struggling with the reality of military fitness standards. After the session, as recruits nursed their exhausted muscles and bruised egos, Audrey called the 3 strugglers aside. "Kim, Martinez, Thompson, follow me." She led them to a small classroom away from the main training area and gestured for them to sit. "I'm going to tell you something that's not in any manual," she began, settling into a chair across from them. "Physical training isn't about punishment. It's not about weeding out the weak. It's about teaching you that your limitations are negotiable." David looked up with surprise. "Drill sergeant?" "You heard me correctly, Kim. Every person in this room has been told at some point that they couldn't do something. The question is whether you're going to accept that assessment or prove it wrong." Over the following weeks, Audrey implemented training methods that would have been unthinkable during her own basic training experience. Instead of simply shouting at struggling recruits, she worked with them individually to identify specific improvement strategies. Instead of treating failure as a character flaw, she framed it as data points for development. The approach wasn't softer, if anything. Her standards were higher than those of traditional drill instructors. But it was smarter, more targeted, and ultimately more effective. David Kim became her primary test case. After identifying that his push-up failures were due to poor form rather than insufficient strength, she spent personal time teaching him proper technique. When he continued to struggle with the mile run, she analyzed his stride pattern and breathing technique, making adjustments that gradually improved his times. Most importantly, she taught him the mental strategies that had carried her through her own darkest moments. "Kim," she said after a particularly brutal training session, "what's the worst thing that can happen if you fail a PT test?" "I get recycled, drill sergeant. Start over with a new company." "And then what? I try again?" "Exactly. Failure isn't permanent unless you decide it is. Every standard you don't meet the first time is just information about what you need to work on." The breakthrough came during week 6, traditionally the point where recruits either found their rhythm or broke under the pressure. The company was conducting their mid-cycle physical fitness test, a crucial evaluation that determined who would continue training, and who would be held back. As David Kim approached the push-up station, Audrey could see the familiar look of determination, mixed with terror that she remembered from her own experience. The test began, and Kim started his repetitions with the improved form she'd taught him: 10 push-ups, 15, 20, at 25. His arms began to shake, but he continued. 30, 35. The other recruits had stopped to watch, recognizing that something significant was happening. At 42 push-ups, well above the minimum standard, Kim finally collapsed, his arms giving out completely. The formation erupted in spontaneous cheering before the other drill instructors restored order, but the real victory came during the mile run. Kim had never broken the minimum time requirement, consistently finishing 30 to 40 seconds too slow. As he approached the final quarter mile of the test, Audrey positioned herself along the route. "Find another gear, Kim," she shouted as he passed. "You've got more left." In that moment, David Kim discovered what Audrey had learned years earlier, that the human body is capable of far more than the human mind typically believes possible. He crossed the finish line with 3 seconds to spare, collapsing immediately, but having achieved something he'd never thought he could do. After the PT test, as the company celebrated their collective success, David approached Audrey privately. "Drill Sergeant, I wanted to thank you. Not just for the training, but for believing I could do it when I didn't believe it myself. Kim, I didn't make you capable of passing that test. I just helped you discover capabilities you already had." The graduation ceremony 8 weeks later was unlike anything Audrey had experienced as a recruit. Standing before 47 new soldiers who had successfully completed basic training, she felt a pride that was entirely different from her personal accomplishments in intelligence work. These weren't analytical victories or professional recognitions. These were human transformations, young Americans who had discovered strengths they didn't know they possessed and developed confidence that would serve them throughout their military careers. Command Sergeant Major Hayes attended the ceremony, seeking out Audrey afterward for a private conversation. "How do you feel about the experience?" Hayes asked. "Honored, Command Sergeant Major. These recruits taught me as much as I taught them." "What did they teach you?" Audrey considered the question carefully. "That everyone's path to excellence is different, but everyone has a path. My job isn't to make them all the same, it's to help each one discover their own version of strength." Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the philosophy we need more of in military training. I'm recommending you for the Advanced Drill Instructor course. We want you to help train the next generation of drill instructors." As the ceremony concluded and the new soldiers prepared to leave Fort Benning for their advanced training, Audrey reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The small girl who'd been told she was too weak, too small, and too emotional for military service had become someone who helped others overcome their own limitations. But more than that, she'd learned that true leadership wasn't about being the strongest or fastest or most naturally gifted. It was about understanding that everyone has potential that extends beyond their apparent limitations, and that the right guidance can help people achieve things they never thought possible. David Kim approached her one final time before boarding his bus for advanced individual training. "Drill Sergeant Lopez," he said, "I'm going into military intelligence. I want to be an analyst like you were." "That's outstanding, Kim. You'll be excellent at it." "I hope so. And someday, maybe I can help other people the way you helped me." As the buses pulled away, carrying her first graduating class toward their military careers, Audrey understood that this was what she'd been preparing for all along. Every obstacle she'd overcome, every challenge she'd faced, every moment of doubt she'd pushed through, all of it had been building toward this opportunity to help others discover their own strength. The recruitment officer who'd told her she'd never survive boot camp had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. Audrey Lopez wasn't built for traditional military service. She was built for something much more important: transforming others who'd been told they weren't built for it either, and proving that excellence comes in forms that can't be measured by conventional standards. Standing alone on the parade ground, where her own military journey had begun, Staff Sergeant Audrey Lopez smiled. Tomorrow would bring a new group of recruits, new challenges, and new opportunities to help young Americans discover that their limitations were far more negotiable than they'd ever imagined. The girl who'd been told she'd never survive boot camp had done something better than survive. She'd become the person who helped others not just survive, but thrive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.